Sometimes people are so adept at writing songs that you can't help but take them for granted. Hey, welcome to Feedback Def. I'm Saby RK, the apostate music journalist, and I want to talk about Sports, the third album from Huey Lewis and the News, which was released 40 years ago to the day that I'm recording this. So I'm recording this on September 15th, 2023. The album was released on the same date in 1983, and there is a new vinyl reissue of the record. Universal just put out a single disc, no bonus tracks version on vinyl today also to mark the 40th anniversary. I also wrote an anniversary piece for Paste magazine that ran today as well. I'd love it if you hit the like and subscribe button. It really helps the channel. You can also follow all my work, or pretty much all my work, in one place at feedbackdef.substack.com. That's linked below. You can also make a donation via PayPal, Venmo, or Ko-fi. The profiles, those are linked below as well, but the profiles are at feedbackdef on all of those platforms. Thank you for even watching this video one way or the other. So I grew up in the 80s. I'm old enough to remember the 70s, but I was 7 at the very end of 1979. And so the 80s is when I started discovering music. And I didn't really think that much about Huey Lewis and the News. They were around. I heard some of the songs that were so popular that they were kind of inescapable. I don't remember ever having an issue with them. I remember the video on the garbage, like the landfill video, being really memorable. And my entire life since then, the hook, like the vocal hook for If This Is It, which is a song on the album Sports, has always stuck with me, and I have a fondness for that song, but I never pursued their records. I just kind of felt like they were part of the wallpaper, and they were maybe a little too soft rock for my liking at the time, and felt to me probably somewhat safe and vanilla, although songs like The Power of Love and other hits by them, but particularly Power of Love, it's like you almost can't help but have an appreciation. Those songs are so, they seem so effortless that you don't put much effort, or I didn't put much effort into even considering them. So I thought, I'm kind of meh on that, but I don't dislike it either. But then you realize, that song's stayed in my head for like decades at a time, and it's actually a really memorable song. And then as more time has gone by since that period, I just feel this wonderful, warm feeling for a lot of the, I guess you would say, cultural artifacts, or like the aesthetics from that time, it actually makes me uncomfortable when younger bands try to recreate that stuff, because it just doesn't feel like it's in the right context for me. It feels like they're just scratching the surface, of course, because they didn't live through the period a lot of the time. And it's kind of like a skin deep recreation. I find it almost a little creepy and unsettling unless it's updated somehow. So I want to get into that because I had been meaning to sit with the whole Huey Lewis catalog, because years ago, a really good friend of mine named Al said to me that he worked in a pizza shop in like the Hudson or the Delaware River Valley part of New York. And said he worked in a pizza shop. It's like a small town with like one regional radio station somewhere in the area. And he was like, yeah, I worked in this pizza shop, and like the hardest thing they would play, like the heaviest thing you would hear, is like Huey Lewis and the News. So I had always assumed he wasn't like too thrilled about them, which I was wrong. And I had been meaning to go back and sit with their whole catalog. I made a Spotify list of all their stuff. And then I got word from the albums editor at Paste, like, hey, we have these anniversaries coming up. Does anybody want Huey Lewis and the News? And I raised my hand. I was like, there's this new reissue. Sure, I'll take it. And the first thing that stood out to me, so I listened to the first record, then the first record, the self-titled record, second one titled Picture This, and then Sports, and then the one after, Four. And the first thing that stood out to me, aside from the really dramatic change in production style, right? So you go from this kind of blue-eyed soul bar band, sort of rock and roll light band with traces of new wave, gradually towards a more like poppy kind of sound. So like, at first when they started, they wouldn't have been out of place like on a bill with like Journey or something like that, or like Boston or Styx. They weren't quite as guitar heavy, but they were certainly a rock and roll band mixed with like blue-eyed soul. And then with Sports, immediately the tone is different. This is like now you're in the 1980s. Whether you were listening to them at the time, that would have been clear to you as soon as you hit play on this record, before even really the instruments even start. There's this like backwards mask. I don't know if it's a piano or a synth or something. It's like a swooshing sound that opens everything. And then there's this like groove that actually is not as electronic as it sounds. It kind of sounds like proto-electro or electro pop, where there's like a guitar and a drum and a keyboard figure, kind of almost like the theme from the show Knight Rider. Very skeletal, very Spartan. The space in the music feels almost completely empty and cold. That's the first thing that stood out. And I'll get back to that in a second. The second thing that stood out was just the sheer consistency of this material. Sometimes people are so adept at writing songs that you can't help but take them for granted. It's like drinking water. It's like as easy as, here's a glass of orange juice, drink it and enjoy it. And you don't really go, man, this is incredible. You just go, okay, someone squeezed this orange into juice and it's great and it's good, right? Until you take stock of the level that they're able to sustain that same satisfaction, right? This album, to me, I wouldn't say it's like filled with songs that could have all been top 10 singles. So there were 4 songs that were top 10 singles. There were 5 singles released. The album spent some time on number 1, or at number 1 on the Billboard Album 200 chart. It was certified 7 times platinum in the U.S. by 1987, and who knows how much it's sold since then. But I wouldn't say every song on here is a hit, but what I would say is that everything just sort of locks perfectly into place on this record. And again, it's easy to kind of overlook how remarkable a feat that is because it's very polished. It is not completely devoid, however, of their heart and soul, even though basically the rock and roll element, like the rock element, is gone by this point. They're completely they've jumped in with both feet into the pop thing. There's like a Hank Williams cover. The song that closes the album is like a blend. It's like New Orleans meets Nashville. And they do it they pull it off in a really kind of cool, smooth, but interesting way. But in spite of the fact that this is unabashed pop and it's populist music too, it's like meant to be just straightforward, enjoyed, and make you feel good. It's almost like a household name beer, right, that you see in the supermarket or all the time, that you crack one open and you're like, oh, it's pretty good, right? Or this is better than I thought. It's not just generic like Drek. So the production, which I was mentioned earlier, the first thing I thought of was Devo. It's got this scooped quality. Now Devo, by 1980, they had like perfected this remarkably Spartan, cold, mechanical sound and a production vibe I'm speaking specifically of the records Freedom of Choice and New Traditionalist. It's also there on Oh No, It's Devo as well. Very much so, actually. But it's almost like full of emptiness. There's a fullness in the emptiness, especially on New Traditionalist. It's like there's a color, there's a hue, there's something you can almost reach into that emptiness and grab onto it. It's got a lot of body in a strange way. I have not come across any indication that they were influenced by Devo at all, but that's the first thing I thought of. That was my reference point. I mean, there's a lot of other records from this time period that have a similar quintessentially 80s production aesthetic. You know, you could go to Pat Benatar, you could go to Billy Joel, you could go to Loverboy, you could go to Styx, you could go to, I mean, there's even a song, like the beginning of the song, Finding a Home, like the clean guitar that starts that song reminded me of Bon Jovi. There's a lot of people from that period you could name that this music just is part of sort of that mosaic. But I really, in listening back now, can appreciate just how sturdy these songs are. Yes, they were going for hits because, as Huey Lewis told Pitchfork, which I'll link that video below, in 2020, he was like looking back on all of his whole catalog, and he said, you know, our back was to the wall. We weren't doing that well. They had one hit off their second album, and this is basically like, okay, you either do this or you're not going to succeed. And he said, you know, we weren't expecting to have 5 hits. So they were going for like the pop jugular in a way, but I feel they retained their heartbeat. And this music is so affable. His presence is so unobtrusive. It's almost like he like is self-deprecating. He's like a front man who laughs at himself the whole way, and he's winking at you. And that's very, very, very relatable. He's not an imposing figure. He doesn't chew up the scenery in the music. It's almost like what I said in my Paste piece. His approach to singing reminds me of drummers who are like, I just serve the song. I just serve the song. I just play only what the song calls for and nothing more. Like, he reminds me of that. And he's such kind of almost like an everyman voice. He's got a sort of a thin, reedy voice that is actually more dexterous and agile and soulful and has a lot more personality and presence than I've ever associated with him based on his videos, his sort of aw shucks kind of yuck yuck, like I'm winking at you personality in his videos, and hey, I'm sort of the comic figure in my own music kind of a thing. And not to mention the rest of the band as well, starting with Chris Hayes, the lead guitar player, who is such a tasty, like his solos are so tasty, and like the whole band here is very focused on like everything is so economical. Everything here is like just cut as close to the bone as you can possibly get, with like no fat, no excess, nothing that like takes any energy for you to digest, nothing that offsets the flow, right? His guitar solos are, I would have to say, almost like unsung, right? Like they're like 80s pop where like the guitar solo just goes in with like surgical precision and is really uplifts the song in this a really amazing way, and then immediately sort of pulls back out. That sort of school of songcraft and arrangement and sculpting a solo to fit within the sort of mission of everything else, I think he warrants more investigation there. I was very struck by how tasty and tasteful his solo work is. Then there's saxophone player Johnny Calla. You know, it's hard for me not to think of Clarence Clemens from the E Street Band, Bruce Springsteen's band, because that like template, that archetype of like the reverb drenched solo, that's really, I don't know, it's almost like a throwback to like what you'd expect from like 1950s bands playing like high school dances or something. There's something very, it's like I'm serving you a dish like that I know you're gonna like, kind of a thing, right? It's like very like French fries and hamburgers or something. Like there's nothing like pretentious about it. It's extremely direct, unpretentious. It's meant to be tasty. You know what you're getting. There's a lot of that with the E Street Band on Springsteen's records and also on some of Billy Joel's records as well. I don't know whether Johnny Colla and Huey Lewis were thinking of it that way or whether they were like, well, actually, this is something we were doing on our own, regardless of what the E Street Band was doing. I don't know that. I'm not saying that's a direct influence on them, but to me, it's in not even the same ballpark. It's like in the seat right next to that. And then there's drummer Bill Gibson, who, much to his credit, I guess, depending on your perspective, because I mean, you can fault these guys for being like, oh, you were a rock and roll band, you were a bar band, and you kind of hacked your antlers off. You know what I mean? Like you shaved your canines down, and the record has those like giant 1980s reverbs every time you hit the snare. The snare is actually really thin, and then there's these like, like explosions of echo that sound really synthetic, and they just like cut off at a certain point. Like very much of the period. As much as you can say, okay, well, where is the driving pulse? Like, what can a drummer do when they're basically confined to this very narrow crawl space? As much as you can say that, you also have to say, like, well, when a drummer learns to work within that, it's actually really, really impressive. It's almost like the drummer's like, okay, well, much like each of my drums is one part of a larger suite of drums, I am going to then serve that same kind of role relative to everybody else in the band and all the other instruments. I was shocked that these guys produced this record themselves. Now, I don't think they achieved the sheen, the like sonic paint job that this music has on their own. Bob Clearmountain mixed this record and Ted Jensen mastered it. That's huge. And there were a bunch of engineers who worked on it as well. I can't imagine the engineers didn't have something to do or even maybe a huge hand in how this record ended up sounding, just even from the source recordings themselves all the way to the mix. But it is really interesting to see, because they worked with Mutt Lange on the record before, it's interesting to see they kind of took their destiny in their own hands. And compared to the record after this, which is also a huge hit, that to me is where they really get kind of, the sound gets really puffed up and very fluffy and inflated in a way that feels, to me, somewhat alienating, although the songs are still, of course, there as well, or where it's like, it's impossible to not think about just that. It's like cotton candy coming at your ears, like it's like right at you. It's like, okay, this is 80s overdose, right? When you compare the two records, you can see that this is just dialed back enough from like being on 10 with all these like fluffy, slick production, like sound palette. And also I get the sense that although the sound of this record is a humongous part of the experience, I get the sense that at this point, these songs, like the craft of songwriting that is exhibited, it's not just Huey Lewis and the News, like Chris Hayes writes with Huey Lewis. There's like a bunch of different writers on this album, but just the craftsmanship involved in the team that put this together from soup to nuts, from like the songs themselves, the arrangements, the choice of sounds, and then the mix. It's like a beautifully polished piece of furniture or something, very smooth and varnished and very, very, very comfortable to sit in. And I keep saying things like that, and I don't mean to sound condescending. I'm very impressed. I'm pleasantly reminded at just how much skill and artistry it takes to pull something off like this. The last thing I'll say, which I said in my Paste piece as well, it's too easy, or a lot of more modern bands make the mistake when they go back and borrow from 80s sounds of intentionally going for this sort of flat, you're inside a two-dimensional space like a video game, or you're in the sort of the headspace of imagining what it's like to be in a video, like a VHS tape or something, like in that sense of like spatial flatness and digitized, right? Like the early onset of the digital media experience. So many bands go for that on purpose. it occurred to me while listening to this, because I was listening on Spotify, which sound, well, like the album sounds kind of flat and like devoid of like it's like you're not even in a room, right? From a psychoacoustic perspective, there's no sense of like, oh, the space ends there at that wall, and you know, these subliminal sensations we have while listening to music. Our minds do, in a vague way, picture some kind of space. Your mind like builds some abstract idea of where you are while listening. It occurred to me because I remembered these songs they were built, constructed to live in 3 dimensions. You were meant to encounter them out in space, out in your life, whether on the radio, in the car, at a bar, outside somewhere. They were meant to be filled up with actual air in the environment you were listening to them in. And that's really where this album comes to life. You have to put it, you know, the video for If This Is It starts with somebody putting batteries in a boombox, and then they're playing, and it's like, oh, Huey Lewis in the News. There's a radio DJ playing another one of the singles from the record. But that's totally where this record is native to. That whole world of you're going out into the world, and songs are traveling through air to meet you in real 3-dimensional space. And that was cool to be reminded of that. I mean, I listened to, I don't know if by 1983, did I have a Walkman by 1983? I don't think I did quite yet. I think it was a little bit later than that, 84, 85 maybe. I know by the time I was 12, I had one of those yellow auto reverse Walkman. But even still, the headphones were not like, they didn't totally seal out everything you were encountering. So even just feeling the breeze on you and hearing the background rumble of traffic or something, you were insulated, but not quite insulated. It wasn't quite like when you're like inside a car versus versus in a convertible. I don't mean listening. I mean just like how you feel inside a car, like you're not part of the surroundings, versus on a bike. When you're on a bike trail or on a convertible or a motorcycle, you're very much engaged with everything around you because you have to be, right? You weren't quite completely in your own bubble. And I think a lot of these songs just hit you so much more naturally when you hear them out, when you're maybe not expecting them. I mean, that's kind of a phenomenon I encounter all the time. Why does this song sound so great and amazing here, versus when I'm listening to it in my room? Not that I don't like it, but it just doesn't hit me the same way, right? It doesn't travel the same way. Well, I mean, it's kind of the epitome of that experience here. And speaking of epitome, I mean, this album is the epitome of the 80s, but what really struck me is that it is also timeless. It is both a hallmark of its time period, but it has lived. It's still very much alive. These songs are very much alive, very vital, very full of energy and almost life-giving, right? You can go to this record and get a lift in a way that doesn't feel vapid, that feels innocent and fun, but you don't have to feel guilty for it. It's not going to like poison you while you're doing that. It's not going to make you dumber while you're doing that. It's not going to like short circuit your awareness. Like some pop music feels like poison bubblegum that will like stick to your system and get into your bloodstream and be like this like toxic slime that corrodes your mind and your consciousness in some way. This isn't like that. This is just like really affable, really easy. And you know, some music should be easy to be with. If this album were a person, it would be somebody that's like so easy to get along with. But it's not easy to make music like this. There's nothing easy about making it. So, kudos to Huey Lewis and the News for making this sound natural and pulling this off. You know, for one of those albums that conquered the charts, I don't have that immediate like revulsion that I feel towards some songs that are so played to death. I don't feel that with this record, and it's a very pleasant experience, and I'm glad it exists. I'm glad music like this exists, and I would encourage everyone, no matter how much you love dark and difficult and challenging and sort of high concept music, I would encourage you to find something that serves this purpose, that you can enjoy and still admire 100% without looking down on. It doesn't have to be one or the other. You don't have to sacrifice. That's the thing with this album. You don't have to sacrifice musical. You don't have to sacrifice being musical to achieve that. A lot of people do, right? That they go straight to the express lane and say, we're chucking what makes our music soulful or have soulfulness, right? But you don't have to. So that's really what I'm walking away from this album with, as much as I am like, it's just a start to finish, really fun, enjoyable, sit down, listen. Thanks for hanging with me. I'm Saby RK, the apostate music journalist, and if this is it, please let me know.